Good day, Dr. Nadia. My name is Claire, and I will be presenting on how the disparities between monist and dualist legal system lead to the difficulties in compliance with the emission reduction targets among countries. Global environmental governance can be defined as the sum of organizations, policy instruments, financing mechanisms, rules, procedures, and norms that regulate the process of global environmental protection. Multilateral environmental agreements, MEAs, are a subset of universal international agreements which focus on environmental issues such as climate change, and the creation of MEAs binds international law. These agreements can appear in different forms such as convention, treaties, or protocol. For example, MEAs related to climate change are the Kyoto Protocol 1997, Paris Agreement 2015, and United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change UNFCCC in 1992. Countries consented to become parties to these agreements through ratification or accession. However, despite widespread acceptance, these different countries may have different targets in compliance with the emission reduction. The application of international law to national law also varies depending on whether the country is under monist or dualist legal system. Now, let me brief you through these two systems. According to international law as it stands today, states are free to choose the ways and means of implementing their international legal obligations, provided that the result is conformity with their obligations. Article 27 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties 1969, a party may not invoke the provision of its internal law as justification for its failure to carry out the international agreement. This was showcased in Alabama Claims Arbitration 1872, the absence of British legislation necessary to prevent the construction or departure of a vessel could not be brought forward as a defense. Monism and dualism were originally two opposing theories of the relationship between international and domestic law. Confusion might arise because there is no single agreed definition of terms. I will now explain in a more general meaning of what is a monist. This system functions where international law is supreme to be directly applicable in the domestic sphere. International law will prevail whenever there is conflict. The doctrine of incorporation that is usually being applied under the monist system states that the international law is automatically incorporated and forms a part of the domestic legal system. Kelsen, an Austrian jurist, points out monist is that one can conceive of international law together with the state legal system as a unified system of norms in exactly the same way as one is accustomed to regarding the state legal system as a unity. Under the monist system, ratification of the international agreement is a form of incorporation of international law to national law. Therefore, a separate set of legislation is not needed in order for the enforcement of international law to be carried out. The example of states that are practicing the monistic system are Belgium, France, and Germany. However, for a dualist approach, Kelsen put the dualist system as international law and state law as two different systems of norms, independent of each other and reciprocally isolated because resting in two different basic norms. Generally, it is where the state law is supreme and there is a complete separation between national law and international law. If conflicts occur, national law will prevail, and which is different with monism. The national law is given its primacy considering it's superior. International law cannot be directly applicable under domestic law as there is a need for international law to be translated into national law. Courts may not apply external law without the authorization of the parliament. This is also known as the doctrine of transformation. For example, UK is a dualist system and it was showcased in the West Rand Gold Mining Co. 1905. Lord Everston stated, whatever had received the common consent of civilized nations must also receive the assent of Great Britain, and such would be applied by the municipal tribunals. All treaties require implementing legislation to have domestic force. Australia, Malaysia, and the United Kingdom are examples of the countries which practice dualism. The disparities between these two systems contribute to difficulties in legal compliance, and I will now explain the legal and practical challenge that the system encounter in harmonizing the domestic legislation with the international commitments. While monist system automatically incorporate international law into domestic law upon ratification, this approach does not guarantee a smooth implementation. The first legal challenge is that conflicts between international obligations and domestic law, as there might be contradiction between these two. The automatic and immediate application of the international law into domestic law upon ratification may result in clashes between the international obligation and existing national law. The environmental commitments under MEA may contradict with national policy on energy that relies on fossil fuel and further leads to confusion in enforcement. For example, countries that rely heavily on oil or coal as source of energy will find that international obligation to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases contradict with their national energy priorities. Therefore, the system will further make it more difficult to compliance with the target of emission reduction. For example, in the case of Trendex Trading Corporation and Central Bank of Nigeria 1977, even though incorporation doctrine was correct, which means the international law is automatically incorporated into national law, but not extended to commercial transaction. This shows that international law will still face limited application when it clashes with the existing domestic law. When it comes to practical challenge, the misalignment of international commitments with national priorities will also occur. The implementation of MEA obligation to reduce the emission often requires transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and the fact that this may lead to contradiction with the countries such as Russia, which is one of the monist countries that rely heavily on fossil fuels such as coal and oil, for domestic consumption of energy when implementing the climate commitments. Low ambition on the climate goals also results in the misalignment. Even though Russia has ratified the Paris Agreement, they are still being criticized for low level of ambition in nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. The energy strategy to 2035 adopted in 2021 focused almost exclusively on promoting fossil fuel extraction, consumption, and exports to the rest of the world. Such a strong focus on increasing reliance on fossil fuel revenues poses a considerable economic risk in a future compliance with Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature limit. The strategy did provide focus on renewable and energy efficiency, but in a very limited means, and the statistic of 5 to 9% increase in fuel production by 2024 if compared to 2018. The growth in energy exports are largely in fossil fuel industry. The legal conflict illustrates the challenge in automatic incorporation of MEA commitment in monist system without aligning them with the national priorities. The recommendation to improve the consistent adherence across the country will be establishing an aligned mechanism before ratification of international law. By having an aligned mechanism before the official ratification, the provision of national law and economic policies of certain countries can meet the international obligations of MEAs. If the example of Russia Energy Strategy 2035 align the goals and comply with Paris Agreement in before ratification, then the conflict on the climate goals can be minimized. By having the same target, there is no difference in the targeted percentage on emission reduction, thus preventing the different opinion and possible argument. But they must show their effort in comply with the agreements. The second legal challenge under the monist system is the broad language of MEA lead to ambiguity in the interpretation. The broad language, such as setting general data such as the percentage of emission reduction of MEAs, may face problems when being applied in countries' specific legal or environmental context. Not only that, the ambiguity of MEAs might lead to the not so consistent interpretation, as courts may interpret the commitments differently, face difficulties in determining how to apply broad environmental obligation to specific cases without clear legal directives from the international agreement, which further leads to uneven application of international law of MEAs. The practical challenge comes when the application in a specific legal or environmental context, as there is lack of specific guidance in enforcement. One of the famous MEAs, the Paris Agreement's commitment to keep the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, is not providing a clear guide to individual sector on how to actually do so. The Netherlands, which is holding a monist system, shows in the case of Urgenda Foundation and Netherlands case that Dutch courts intervened to compel the government to take a stronger climate action, as the broad commitments under the Paris Agreements does not provide sufficient direction on the way of enforcement. The court could have grounded the judgment as exercising the discretion accepted under the UNFCCC jurisprudence in light of national circumstances of the Netherlands. Therefore, there is a need to interpret the Paris Agreement in conjunction with Dutch law in order to fill the gaps between the agreement and national law to ensure compliance. Courts may lack the expertise to determine how to enforce MEA targets effectively, especially when the language of MEA is general or ambiguous. The recommendation to have consistent adherence is to establish an advisory body to provide professional opinion in the way to interpret and guideline towards MEA commitments. The body might fall under UNFCCC as they have the most complete information to be always ready to clarify the doubt from those countries which are unclear on their compliance on MEAs. For instance, IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, plays an important role in providing regular assessment of the scientific basis on climate change and the impacts of future risks and options for the adoption. In the dualist system, the biggest legal challenge is that the process will most likely lead to legislative delays, as amending the draft debate and passing the law may take years. If there is legislative delay, there is a possibility in failing to meet the timeline specified in the international agreements and further undermines the effectiveness of multilateral efforts, such as agreements with specific deadlines and targets where Paris Agreement set the greenhouse gas emission must peak before 2025 at the latest and decline 43% by 2030. The practical challenge is the need for reconciling the international commitments with domestic realities. For MEA, such as Paris Agreement or Kyoto Protocol, the government might need to pass new law or amend the existing law to reflect its obligation. Australian government initially debated vigorously on the impact of emission reduction, which is very costly due to the dependence on fossil fuels for export revenue. Therefore, this prolonged the legislative process and slowed down the application of Kyoto Protocol into the domestic law. Malaysia also facing the same problem while implementing the international commitment from Paris Agreement, as there is consultation needed. Currently, 20 to 30% of Malaysia's economy rely on sectors which will likely face transition risks, which include oil and gas, power, etc. Bank Negara estimated that the country stands to lose 65.3 billion worth of annual export revenue if it fails to comply to this transition risk. Practical challenges are exacerbated by the need to reconcile international commitment with national economic realities and political priorities. The recommendation to prevent legislative delay is that countries should establish specialized committees or departments with dedication to environmental law to expedite the process by reducing the concern problem and focusing on MEA-related legislation. For example, dualist country like India can be used as an example, where Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change which concern on implementation of the policies and program on environmental issues. They also provide justification which enable a fast passage of the treaty in parliament, such as the ratification of Paris Agreement by Prime Minister Sri Narendra Modi on 2nd October 2016. This enables the MEA obligation to be implemented within the required timelines and further minimize the risk of non-compliances. Another crucial challenge under dualist system arises due to fragmentation across the jurisdiction, as in the federal states, the subnational units may have different opinions and willingness to implement the obligation of MEAs, which further causes inconsistent compliance in harmonizing the domestic legislation with international commitments. International treaties such as Paris Agreement and Kyoto Protocol require domestic legislation, and states or regions might vary in their implementation of the laws. Under Kyoto Protocol, Canada, also a dualist system, faced similar challenges. The provincial government varied widely in their climate policies, creating uneven progress towards the national targets and finally lead to the withdrawal in 2011. Practical challenge comes when there is divergence of subnational implementation of international commitments. Dualist system emphasizes the sovereignty of domestic law, requiring treaties to be domesticated through national legislation. Disparities in the climate action might also occur, and another example is that Canada, such as Quebec, which is one of the provinces, implement carbon taxes and 2030 plan for green economy policy in order to commit to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 37.5% from 1990 to 2030. Quebec also committed to becoming carbon neutral by 2050. However, the province like Alberta mainly rely on procuring crude oil from tar sand, which would require a large amount of energy and resistant measures that could possibly cause harm to them. However, the lack of cohesive progress leads to exit of the emission limits by 17% above the 1990 levels, leads Canada to withdraw from Kyoto Protocol in 2011. One of the case in UK, where Crown against Heathrow Airport 2020, the Supreme Court allowed the appeal in favour to build the third runway of Heathrow Airport and held against the commitment of UK in the Paris Agreement. This clearly demonstrates how the action of subnational may lead to contradiction with national policy. The recommendation to increase the consistent adherence is to develop a coordination framework between federal and subnational units. Federal government must provide detailed guidance on implementing MEA obligations and allocate financial resources to support the subnational entities. This reduces resistance and ensures consistent application. The roles of both federal and subnational needs to be divided clearly based on their capacity and at the same time not neglect the national priority to get a win-win situation where international commitments are met and the national economy is not being undermined. To conclude my presentation today, there are still a variety of challenges being encountered by both systems either legally or practically, such as the contradiction of domestic law and international law broad language interpretation, which leads to ambiguity under monism, legislative delay due to the need of transformation and fragmentation under dualism. However, the recommendation on how to tackle these challenges need to be implemented in real life with every single department's cooperation in order to have a consistent adherence across these two legal systems. Thank you.